Hey guys, welcome to the Amplified Network. Just wanted to give a big shout out to our sponsors. First, we have the Mouse Merch Box. They are the official Disney subscription box. A quarterly box is $60 if you subscribe, or $70 per box. Each box comes with $120 to $150 worth of exclusive Disney merchandise, so be sure to check them out. We do have a coupon code. If you use the code SPRINGS20, you're going to save 20% off of your order. Next, we have the Great Adventure Supply Company. Great Adventure Supply Company has 80s and 90s pop culture themed Disney apparel. They just released some new stuff. I believe it was last week. So go on ahead and check them out as well. Everything is awesome. The coupon code for Great Adventure Supply Company is going to be MAGIC15. So be sure you check them out as well. Thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to you, the viewers. So you are tuned into Amplified Network. Enjoy the show.
Man, I mean, the water buffalo was just as surprised as I was.
Hi, welcome to Dungeon Seekers. My name is Mackenzie.
And I'm Steve.
And today we're talking about ability scores and water buffalo. Ability scores. So, if you're new to D&D, you probably know that ability scores exist, and that's probably the extent of your knowledge as to what they are. You probably know that you roll dice to determine them, and that they exist, and that they're numbers at the top of your character sheet. But what do they actually do?
Pretty much everything. They are going to basically be number one, the things that determine your character in its entirety. You know, you have your background, you have traits, you have flaws, and that kind of thing that you can totally. There's a bunch of different resources for that, either in the player's handbook, in some of the supplements, or just come up with it yourself. Or if you've seen one of the other episodes of Dungeon Seekers, when you go into background and that kind of stuff, that's really more about motivation and how to roleplay the character. But this is really going to determine a lot of the things about your character as far as playtime goes.
So, we have a very common analogy that you can find on pretty much any website. If you just search for D&D ability scores, there's really one analogy that explains and sums up ability scores pretty well. And that is the tomato analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, the 6 ability scores, if you don't know, they are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So the tomato analogy basically is strength is your ability to throw a tomato really hard. Dexterity is the ability to dodge a tomato that's been thrown at you. Constitution is the ability to eat a bad tomato. Intelligence is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. And then charisma is the ability to sell a tomato-based fruit salad.
Right. So, if that didn't leave you more confused than you were when you got here, then we're off to a great start. So, you've been introduced to what the ability scores, or what the abilities are, and a very, very brief summary of what each of them means. So each class has ability scores that they really should focus on a little bit more, and there are also bonuses to certain ability scores based on your race or class. So let's go on ahead and get started with strength.
Yeah, so strength is, as it's stated on page 12 of the Player's Handbook, 5th edition, Natural athleticism or bodily power. Strength, I feel like more than anything, is fairly self-explanatory. The higher the score is, the stronger your character is going to be. The physical toughness and that kind of thing. So that's going to be important, number one, for melee fighters. So we're talking barbarians, fighters, paladins, people that are going to be that are going to rely on brute strength a lot. So if you are a character that's not going to be relying on that, you don't really need to worry about that too much.
Right. So there are some races that are going to get a bonus to their strength. So that's going to be mountain dwarves get +2, dragonborn get +2, half orcs get +2, and humans get +1.
Yeah, and the thing about humans, as far as when you're picking a race, they're good because they're kind of good at everything, so they're actually going to get a +1 to every ability score. Certain races are only going to get maybe +1 or +2 to 1 or 2 ability scores. Some races actually have sub-races that are going to give you additional bonuses. So that's why they make that distinction between mountain dwarfs as opposed to hill dwarves, or just generally speaking, just dwarves in general. So certain races are going to get certain ability bonuses, but humans get a +1 to everything right off the bat.
So if you're boring and decide to play a human in Dungeons and Dragons, you get a bonus for being boring.
Sure, yeah, let's go with that.
It's my story. I'm sticking to it. All right, so next we have dexterity.
Dexterity is going to be, physical agility, reflexes, balances, mobility, that kind of thing. Dexterity is really important to people like monks, rangers, and rogues. One, because especially monks and rogues, they need to move around very quickly. Usually they're going to use finesse weapons, which means that even though it's a melee weapon, it's something that you can actually add your dexterity score instead of your strength score. Most melee weapons, because it's strength, you want to figure out how hard you're going to hit something. So if you think about it, how hard you can swing a club, that's going to be strength based. But if you're playing with like a dagger or a rapier that you're trying to duel with someone, it's easier. It's better to have a higher dexterity score because you got to find those openings or something.
And dexterity is also going to help with your armor class.
Yes, absolutely.
So the higher your dexterity, typically the higher your armor class. Obviously, there's more that goes into armor class than just dexterity. But depending on the class you're playing, that can have a big role in your armor class as well.
Yeah.
So races that get bonuses to dexterity. Let's see. Elves get +2. Halflings get +2. Forest gnomes, that's me, get +1. And humans get +1.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like already you're kind of seeing, so mountain dwarves, dragonborns, half-orcs, they get that bonus to strength. They're the hardier, they're the big beefy types. Dexterity, elves, halflings, they're a little bit more lithe. They're a little bit more mobile just right off the bat. So you're going to kind of see, okay, yeah, kind of making a little bit sense here. And if you're confused about that whole armor class thing, it's like, wait, how is dexterity factoring into armor? Armor class isn't necessarily just if you can take a hit. It's more of if you can avoid getting hit also. Mm-hmm. So that's the part of the thing about dexterity, being able to dodge. So if you're one of those classes that doesn't really wear armors, like your wizards or sorcerers, dexterity is really important to you as well, even though it doesn't say right off the bat monks, rangers, rogues. Those are the absolutely most important. But it's also important to wizards, bards sometimes, depending on what armor. Yeah.
Squishy.
Anyone's
if you're squishy, dexterity isn't necessarily your main focus, but you definitely need to keep it in mind.
Yeah, you don't want to necessarily make it your quote-unquote dump stat, which we'll get to later.
All right, next we have Constitution.
Yeah, so that's going to be health, stamina, your vital force, if you will, your internal fortitude. It's more of like an inner strength. That's why it's that you can eat a bad tomato and keep going. So if you have a strong constitution, you're going to be able to. That's more important for if you're trying to fight some sort of poisonous effect or something like that. Or if you on the other side, if you have a low constitution score, you're going to maybe be a little bit more squeamish, or be susceptible to poison or spicy food.
That is a good way to put it. Okay, so races that have a bonus to Constitution. Dwarves have +2. Stout Halfling has +1. A Rock Gnome has +1. A Half-Orc has +1. And as always, a human has +1.
Yes. And the other thing about Constitution being very important, because as the player handbook says, it's important for everyone. This also determines partially how many hit points you're going to have. Anytime you level up, either whether you're going to roll the dice or you're going to take that average, whatever it might be, you also add your Constitution bonus, your ability modifier, to however many hit points you're going to get each time you level up. So it's super important for everyone, too.
Unless you like being really super squishy and easy to kill, in which case, don't worry about it.
There's that.
Yeah. All right. Next, we have Intelligence, which is not the same as Wisdom.
Correct. So Intelligence, it is more that mental acuity, information recall, analytic skill, overall your intelligence. This is what we would also call book smarts.
I was about to say that. Whereas Wisdom would be your street smarts. So Intelligence is going to be most important typically for spellcasters. So specifically wizards. Let's see. Races that get bonuses. High elves get +1. Gnomes get +2. Tieflings get +1. And humans are humans, so they get +1.
Yeah, I mean, intelligence is one of those things where everybody wants to be smart, but your class might not necessarily need to be smart. Wizards need to be smart because of how they get their magic. They get their magic by intense study and, being basically that bookworm. So intelligence is really important key there.
If you're a barbarian, it's probably not going to be as important.
Yeah, exactly. Not everybody needs to be book smart.
Some people just need to be street smart. Some people really don't need to be either. Yeah. Not going to name any names. So next is Wisdom, aka street smarts.
And this is awareness, insight, intuition. Like we said, that's street smarts. Generally speaking, it's going to be your ability to kind of have that situational awareness. So this is going to be important for perception checks, either to spot something in a room or maybe to get some sort of insight as to see maybe if a character that you're interacting with is actually telling you the truth or not. So that's important for Wisdom. Also just kind of generally, again, what I call situational awareness, or if you will, reading the room. Someone that is going to have a high Wisdom is probably going to be okay in certain social interactions, and not going to be making those kind of, faux pas, if you will. A low Wisdom score is generally going to be kind of maybe that bumbling person, but we'll kind of get a little bit more into that later.
Still not naming names. So classes that really benefit from a high Wisdom score are going to be specifically clerics and druids.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't sure if there are any others. I mean, there are others that you might want it, but those ones really kind of need it. And then races that have bonuses for Wisdom. Hill dwarves have +1. Wood elves have +1. And as always, humans have +1. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people think, all elves are very wise. Not necessarily. That one, there are a lot fewer bonuses based on race than a lot of the others.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's kind of an old saying goes, with with knowledge comes wisdom. With wisdom comes understanding. So it's not necessarily intelligence and wisdom don't necessarily have to go together. Just because you have a high intelligence doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a high wisdom as well.
And vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa. So you could, not necessarily know how to solve a quadratic equation, but you have a little bit more better understanding of, the world at large, if you will.
And for me, I think one of the hardest things to grasp when I started playing was that wisdom and intelligence don't have to go hand in hand, because normally when you think about them, you think, okay, they were kind of the same thing. But when you break it down to book smarts versus street smarts, you realize that, even outside of the game world, they are two very different things that a lot of times go hand in hand, but a lot of times, there might be someone who's very, very intelligent who just has no idea what's going on in the world around them.
Not naming names.
No, of course not. We would never name names. But it's one of those, you can have a lot of fun playing a character like that. You just have to... What's the best way? Don't overdo it.
Yeah, I think maybe we can get into that on our role-playing episode. When we're talking about role-playing.
I think that's going to be what our entire episode is.
Probably.
All right, so last we have charisma.
Yeah, and charisma, that's your confidence, your eloquence, leadership skills maybe.
Gilderoy Lockhart.
Yeah, that's certain. You could kind of make an argument one way or the other for him having either a high or a low charisma.
Why not both?
Right. It's that tough where, someone with a high charisma also, you might also maybe consider that the likability factor, or that someone with a high charisma is going to have a certain amount of flair, a certain amount of likability. It's that person in the room that people kind of gravitate towards. They're going to be like a good storyteller, or something along those lines. Where again, so that's going to be important for bards, sorcerers, and warlocks, because that's where you get your basically your spellcasting ability from. This is what we call your spellcasting ability for bards, warlocks, and sorcerers, is your charisma, that just kind of natural flair.
Right. So races that have bonuses to charisma, half-elves have +2, drow have +1, Lightfoot halflings have +1, dragonborn have +1, humans have +1, and tieflings have +2.
Yeah, and some of those are a little bit more of what you might call monstrous races. Your drows, your dragonborns, tieflings. They're a little bit more uncommon, and they're a little bit more out, further away from what a human looks like, or those quote unquote normal people. But it's still, they can still have high charisma, because they can also still have, there's maybe some sort of mysterious quality to them, or just intimidation.
Right.
Which is also charisma based.
They're able to walk into a room and just kind of take command. They walk in and people are like, "Oh, a tiefling. Why are they here? It must be something important, or at the very least interesting." Or their name is Jester.
That could be. Someone with a low charisma might tend to, and again, it depends on how you play it. You could either play them as awkward in social situations, or just abrasive, which are the other spectrum of low ability, charisma-wise.
Right, which I feel like a lot of people don't realize that, like with charisma especially, the way the spectrum is as far as like personality, I guess you could say, goes, like high charisma is going to be right in the middle instead of like one end or the other, whereas like intelligence, for example, it's just a straight scale.
Yeah.
Think bell curve.
Yeah. Charisma, there's a little bit more nuances to I feel like charisma and wisdom more than some of the other ability scores.
Right. Okay, so let's see. So ability scores and modifiers. That's something that, again, I didn't really understand how it worked for probably the first month that we played our first game. Granted, we were playing 3.5, so I still don't know that I know how any of it works in 3.5. But if you have a player's handbook, which I think you should have a player's handbook, there is a very nice table on page 13 of the player's handbook that basically shows you what your ability modifier is based on your ability. So ability modifiers are going to help you out with your skills.
Yes. And this is before going into, what a skill is and what kind of abilities you're going to add to it and proficiency bonuses and that kind of thing. So ability scores and modifiers right off the bat. A 10 or an 11 as an ability score. So say you have a 10 in strength. That's considered average. You're not going to get a penalty for having a 10 or 11, but you're not necessarily going to get a bonus to it either. Any step above that, or increasing by 2, so a 12 or a 13, that's going to be slightly above average. That's going to get you a +1 to it. And then it goes up to a maximum of 30. Usually, actually, it's a maximum of 20 most of the time, as far as getting that to a, in most regular ways, like character advancement, and you can actually add to your ability scores later on as you kind of increase in level. But usually the cap is right around 20, which would get you a +5. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you get an 8 or a 9, that's going to give you a -1 penalty. And what that means is when you do that D20 dice roll on certain ability checks or saving throws or whatever the case is, you could either, right off the bat, you're either going to start adding numbers or subtracting numbers without getting into proficiency bonus and any other sort of skill bonuses you might have.
Right. So I know a lot of beginning players who, they'll write down their ability scores, and there's the box for modifiers, and they don't know what it is, so they just leave it blank. So now find the table on page 13, or just do math. Fill that in, because it's going to make your life a lot easier than having to look and do math every time.
Yeah. So if you're using the standard 5th edition character sheet, that side on the left, you'll see that column that's going down the left, and it starts strength, dexterity, constitution. There's kind of a rectangular box to it, and then also there's a little oval in the middle, towards the bottom.
Oh, look, we
look at
have
that.
a character sheet.
Here you go. Yeah.
So, on the side towards the crease of the book.
Where the glare is.
Where the glare is. I'll probably post a better picture.
Yeah. So if you actually have that page open, or if you want to follow along as I want to do this. So you get that rectangular shape and then the oval inside it. So you can do one of two things. The at least from what I've seen, the traditional way to do it is putting your ability score, the actual score itself, in the big part, in the big rectangle, and then your bonus as a plus or a negative representation in the oval. I've also seen it flipped, where the big number is the bonus, and then the small number is the actual score. And at first when I saw that, I was like, no, that's blasphemy. But then I'm thinking about it, and it's like, that's actually not a bad idea, because what's more important is the bonus. It's not necessarily what the score actually is.
You very rarely pay attention to what your actual score is. Yeah. Usually it's the bonus. So, again, I do everything on D&D Beyond, so I don't put anything in any boxes. It does it for me. But there are some people that we play with who I think could benefit from putting their modifier in the large box so they can find it, because they struggle to find it.
Yeah. And before we talk about skills and saving throws and that kind of thing, which is mostly how you use those ability scores, we could probably talk about how you actually get those ability scores.
Dice.
Well, not always. So the traditional
Sometimes
way,
dice.
the traditional way, at least the way that we have, the way that we've done it, every time we've played and started to roll up a character, is you take 4d6s, which is this guy right here. You take 4 of them, and you roll that. You roll 4d6. You drop the lowest number of that, and then you add the total for the other 3 dice together. And that's your ability score for one of your abilities. And you do that 6 times, so that's going to get you 6 different numbers. The traditional way of, I don't know, I guess our traditional way of doing it is then you take your class, you figure out, okay, if I'm playing a barbarian, I want to put my highest number in strength, maybe second highest number in constitution, and so on. And then after that, you go through and you add any sort of racial ability modifiers. So if I'm playing a Mountain Dwarf barbarian, I'm still going to add +2 to my strength and kind of so on. The other way of doing it, of course, which might be a little bit more funner and lead to very interesting role-playing opportunities, is by just going down the line and saying, okay, the first number that you're going to roll is your strength. Your second number that you're rolling is your dexterity, so that you're really living and dying by the dice, where if you roll really poorly that first time around and you get a really low strength score, that could be really interesting.
While he thinks that that's a more fun way to do it, for me, that's a much more anxiety-inducing way of doing it.
That's fair.
Like, I would have a lot of negative feelings about that experience. So since Steve is our DM, please don't ever make me do that. There is another way to come up with your ability scores, aside from rolling your 46 and
that's just taking them from the player's handbook. One of the ways. So they give you just a set of ability scores that you can try and pick and choose which one, and it would go 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8, which means that you're going to wind up with 1 or 2, maybe depending on the way your racial bonuses are going to end up going. 1 or 2 high scores, a couple medium scores, and then maybe 1 or 2 low scores, which is a good mix. You could kind of, and that's going to say, okay, I know I'm going to have 1 or 2 really good scores. I know I might have 1 or 2 that are not so good. When you roll your own scores, even though you are at the end of the day picking most of the time which actual numbers go to which ability scores, if your highest ability score is still a 13 or a 14, not necessarily doing that good. And if you roll a couple of not so great numbers, you might be stuck with a couple of hindrances that you might not necessarily want. So that's a good way of kind of keeping it simple, especially if you're a first-time player, or if you're trying to just do a one-shot really quickly. It's really good to just have those numbers in your back pocket in case you want to just say, okay, I'm going to use those, write them down, and I'm good to go.
Which, that's something that I feel like a lot of DMs will be fine with you just using those. Some might be like, no, I want you to roll like everybody else. So, I mean, it's going to change a little bit based on the game you're playing, who you're playing with.
Yeah, and I mean, it's honestly, to me, it's actually one of the most fun parts about making a character is rolling up those ability scores.
Most fun,
I might also have a gambling
terrifying.
problem, but, that's just me.
For me, rolling ability scores is like, I don't want to say the most terrifying part of D&D, because death is a very real possibility in D&D. But as far as the character prep, I always get nervous when rolling ability scores, because I have a bad habit of rolling low numbers just in general. So there's that.
I mean, the other side of that is how lenient or how much pity your DM wants to take on you. Where I've had it where I've just had someone roll absolutely terribly with the ability scores, and that's kind of necessarily one of those things where it's like, oh, that's kind of crappy. So depending on what those are, I might have them re-roll one of them, or I might say, okay, we'll kind of maybe smudge it a little bit and maybe give you a boost to 1 or 2. Just to try and make sure, because you're going to be living with those things for the rest of the campaign, however long that might be. So
years. It could be years.
It could be. So you don't necessarily want to walk around with those ability scores that are really low. So
Or maybe you do. It
maybe you
depends
do,
on the
yeah.
character you're playing.
maybe your GM is going to give you an opportunity to boost those in somehow. That's more one of those things that it goes back to your DM and how much you can bribe them.
I mean, you can always offer to bake them red velvet cheesecake brownies
And then never deliver.
and then never deliver. But if it gets your character what you want for your character, I mean, just if you never deliver, then the DM might take that out on you. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah. Maybe. So anyway, one of the variants to doing ability scores or customizing ability scores, as shown on page 13 of the player's handbook. If you, for some reason, don't like rolling dice, which I don't know why you're playing D&D if you don't like
rolling dice, then just turn us off now and
we'll finish the episode, but then
just stick to video games.
Yeah. Maybe rolling dice gives the rolling of the ability scores gives you a little bit too much anxiety.
But I still get to roll dice, so I still do it.
At any rate, one of the interesting ways to do ability scores is by kind of buying them with points. So there are a couple of ways to do this, but the player's handbook gives a really cool idea for how to do that. Basically, you have a set of 27 points. You start off with 27 points, and then each ability score you want to purchase is going to be worth a certain amount of points. Now, an ability score of 8 is going to cost you 0 points. An ability score of 9 is going to cost you 1, and so on until you get to your maximum ability score that you can purchase in this way, which would be a 15 at 9 points. And the idea behind that is you can do anything from getting 3 really good scores at a 15 without any sort of racial bonuses or anything like that, and then really 3 kind of lower ability scores in those 3 8s. And then you could also go to the other side of the spectrum and just get, 3 12s and 3 13s, which are going to be really average, or anything in between. So maybe you could dump a couple of those into really high. So you want, maybe 2 high 15s, and then you're left over with maybe kind of buying a couple of lower level, and then you might wind up with 1 or 2 lower scores. This is really interesting. Because it gives actually a little bit more control over your ability scores, as far as instead of living and dying by your dice rolls.
You're not leaving it up to chance.
Yeah. And I mean, if you go, and it's one of those things where if you go with the 3 15s, because each 15 is worth 9 points, so you're only going to be able to buy those, and then you're left over with 3 8s. You're playing a human. You're going to get a +1 to each one of those 15s, which is going to round up to a 16. And you got 3 ability scores right off the bat that's going to give you a +3. So that's kind of an interesting way to do it. What do you think?
I mean, then you also have 3 that are going to give you a -1.
And that's just 3 different opportunities for doing awesome role-playing.
Very true. I personally still... Even though it makes me anxious, I still prefer rolling to see what I can get, because then I have the possibility of getting higher than a 15 or a 16. But, you also have the possibility of getting lower than an 8. So, I mean, yes, it's leaving it up to chance versus saying, okay, I want control over the character. For me, I enjoy the mild panic attack that I have when rolling ability scores, because that's part of the kind of getting excited about the game and getting into the character.
Yeah, I could definitely see it as a little bit of a roller coaster ride, as you're like trying to figure out, what's going to happen. Then you get like 1 or 2 really good ones, and then 1 or 2 really bad ones, and then maybe it'll even out. But yeah, so. Knowing probability in dice, theoretically the highest number that you could get is an 18, rolling the 6s, or rolling the d6s, and the lowest score would be a 3, which personally, if you wind up with a 3, as a DM, I would say, okay, well, maybe let's re-roll that one once, and then, whatever else happens.
And then if you end up with a 3 again, then he's going to lose all hope for your character.
Yeah, then you just need new dice.
Yeah. That's a call for dice jail. That can be discussed at a later date.
Yeah. But that's the thing about ability scores. At least when we're talking about rolling them and everything, I don't necessarily believe in not having any low ability scores, because sometimes the best times and the best moments in the game, especially role playing wise, are when you have those low ability scores and it comes into play, and it's at the end of the day, this game is about having fun, right? It's a game, and those are the most. I know. It's right here on the cover of the book. World's greatest role playing game.
Oh, it's a game. Yeah. That explains so much.
Yeah.
I understand now.
I don't even know where to go with that. No, I lost my train of thought. So skills.
Skills.
Right.
We've got skills. They're modifying. I had to sneak that in there, and I think I broke him.
So next to your ability scores on the
character sheet.
On the character sheet.
It's going to be your skills.
Right. So there are two boxes here. There's the skills and the saving throws. Both you kind of use the same, just in different situations. So saving throws, it's a little bit easier. You got strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So there are 6 different kinds of saving throws. And those are to basically save yourself from some sort of either situation or maybe even magical effect or that kind of thing. And it's aligned to whatever ability score we're looking at. So a dexterity saving throw is going to maybe stop yourself from falling off of a ledge, or you're going to be able to dodge a fireball or a trap or something like that. A constitution saving throw is going to be to try and fight some sort of internal effect, so like a poison or disease or something like that.
Or like mind control.
I think that's more of either.
Was that one mind control?
That's more of an intelligence or a wisdom.
Probably intelligence. I don't know.
I
don't even mind
some
control,
are different.
bro.
So intelligence, our intelligence saving throws would be more of like being able to like see through an illusion. Wisdom is more of the because you're talking more of like your brain power in a way. So that's going to be more of trying to fight against a mind control. Charisma could either be to try and not be afraid of something, so some sort of fear effect, or also could potentially be some sort of charm effect as well, depending on what the situation or what the spell calls for. Next are going to be skills, and again, they're tied to one of the 6 ability scores. So, for example, acrobatics, how well you can, dip, dive, or dodge. That's going to be your dexterity based, how well you can kind of maybe, recover from a fall or something like that. Animal handling, that's going to be wisdom, because that's going to be how well you can, interact with a creature and that kind of thing. Arcana is strictly intelligence, because it's more of how well you've studied in the arcane arts. And it goes down the list, based on...
And they're all labeled for you.
Yes, the great thing about it is that they're all labeled for you. So what I like to do is I like to go down the list and just add my bonuses, whatever it is, to whatever ability score it is. That way it's a little bit easier to try and find it, other than, okay, I have to do a nature check. Okay, that's intelligence. What's my intelligence bonus? Right. You got it right there.
Basically, work smarter, not harder.
Yes.
Just go on ahead, write it all down, even if you're like, oh, well, this is easy. I'm adding 2 + 2. Okay, well, if you just have to look at the piece of paper and it says, animal handling +4, cool. You don't have to do math.
Yeah, you don't want to turn this into, doing your taxes or that kind of thing.
This is already Math the Game. Don't make it a more complicated version of Math the Game.
Right, you don't want to turn it into a scavenger hunt as well.
As fun as that sounds,
right.
That's basically the game. You don't want that to be your character sheet.
Yeah. So you'll also notice in those boxes is a little radio button, if you will, that you can bubble in. And that is for your proficiencies.
Radio.
What?
Radio.
Your proficiencies. So your proficiency bonus is going to be, just how good you are at certain things. And that bonus is a set number that you basically that increases as you get higher in character level. Now, if you are a bard, sometimes proficiency bonus works a little bit different, but that's more of a bard thing. But there are certain saving throws and certain skills that you are going to be proficient in. And that is something that you get while you're creating your character from the get-go. Your classes are going to have one or two saving throws that you're proficient in, and you're going to get certain skills that you're proficient in based on your class, based on your race, and sometimes based on your background, if you choose one of the backgrounds that's here in the player's handbook. So anything that you are proficient in, you're going to add that bonus to as well. So I like to bubble it in next to it, and then you add that number along with your ability score bonus. So if you are, for example, a level 4 rogue, you get a +2 proficiency bonus. That's a set number. And then say you have a dexterity of 16, that's going to give you a +3 to dexterity. So then if you are proficient in something like stealth, which you should be as a rogue,
I would certainly hope so.
Yeah, you're going to get your +3 from your dexterity and your +2 from your proficiency bonus, which is going to give you a +5 overall. So that means that when it's time to make that dexterity check, you're going to roll that d20. Then whatever number you get, you're going to add 5 to it, and that's going to be your result for your check. And that is one of those things that, especially for new players, one of the first things that happens is, I want to do this really cool thing, and then I'm like, okay, make an acrobatics check. What?
Like, how do I do that?
So, and it's really easy. They're just right here on the list.
And I've seen so many people who don't write it down, and then they think, okay, acrobatics, that's dexterity, and they just add their dexterity modifier because they forgot that they have an additional bonus because they didn't write it down.
Yeah. So always make sure that you're aware of what you can add your proficiency bonus to, especially when it comes to things like attack rolls. You're always, as long as you are proficient with the weapon that you are wielding, whether it's a melee weapon or a ranged weapon, you're adding your proficiency bonus to it, which is super important because
people forget all the time.
Yeah, if you're off by 1 or 2 numbers, that could really make the difference in a hit or a miss.
Marisha Ray.
Well, and even people that we've played to,
all the time.
with people that have been playing with for years, they're like, wait, have I been supposed to be adding my proficiency bonus to
I feel like it happens not necessarily every time we play, but like once every month or so that someone's like, wait a minute, I haven't been adding this. Can I go back and add it? And it's like, we're at the end of the battle. No, you can't go back and add it, but I'm glad that you noticed.
Yeah. Now, your ability scores are also going to be very important if you are either a spellcaster or have some sort of ability that requires a saving throw. So, like, for example, monks have a few different abilities where if they attack a creature, the creature has to make some sort of saving throw. Otherwise, they suffer some sort of effect. It could be a stunning strike. It could be, a few different things. So that's when we get to your save DCs, which is, I think, difficulty class, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds right to me. We'll go with that.
If not, it should be. So basically,
we've renamed it if that's not what it's called.
Basically, that is how hard a certain challenge or situation is to overcome. So something with a 5 DC is going to be super easy. Basically, as long as you don't flub that dice roll, you're probably going to make it. 10.
And even if you do flub your dice roll, there's a decent chance that you have modifiers that will keep you from flubbing that dice roll.
Yeah, unless you roll a natural 1, which...
Then you're screwed.
Yeah. 10, a little bit harder. 15, a little bit harder. 20, maybe next to impossible. Anything more than that, and you're
20, you're praying to the dice gods may the odds be ever
or
in your
unless you
favor.
have some sort of ridiculously high bonus, especially certain classes when, especially like we're talking rogues, sometimes they can double their proficiency bonus to certain ability checks, so that by the time you could start off with a 10 and wind up with a 26,
Which I'm jealous of.
yeah. But so there are 3 different things that are important to spellcasters or anybody that has some sort of effect like that. So your spellcasting ability, that is going to be basically how you get your spellcasting, how you get your spells, how do you get that power. For most divine spellcasters, which there's 2 different kind of schools of magic overall. There's divine or arcane. Divine, we're talking clerics, druids, rangers, a little bit more maybe nature-based, or most of the time this is religion-based or healing, that kind of thing. Whereas arcane magic is usually a little bit flashier. It's a broader spectrum, certainly. So most arcane spellcasters have charisma because it is a little bit flashier. The only exception is wizards, who we talked about having that intelligence ability score. So your spellcasting ability, if you're looking at your, the standard character sheet, your spellcasting ability, you probably want to write whatever actual ability that is, whether it's wisdom, intelligence, or charisma. Write that there, maybe along with whatever bonus it is.
I usually just write the bonus and then forget what the actual ability is.
Yeah.
And then you ask me what the ability is, and then I give you a blank stare and say, the bonus is this.
Yeah. Your spell save DC, again, is what your opponent has to beat in order to avoid whatever effect you're trying to give them. And that goes fairly standard. It's 8 plus whatever your spellcasting ability modifier is, plus your proficiency bonus. So if your ability score, so you're starting with 8, and then if you have a proficiency bonus of 2, that's 10. And then if your spellcasting ability is a 16, that's going to be another plus 3, so that your spell save DC ends up being 13. So that's what most of the time what the DM has to roll in order for that monster to either avoid the effect or be succumb to its effect, whatever it is. And then your spell attack bonus most of the time is just going to be your proficiency bonus plus your spellcasting ability. So again, going back to that 16 score, whatever it might be, you get your plus 2 and your plus 3. So that's going to give you a plus 5 to your spell attack bonus. And certain attacks, like trying to think of one off the top of my head, like a fire bolt. Would actually require you to, you're throwing a bolt of fire, so you're trying to hit that person. So that's your spell attack bonus. Sometimes you actually need a melee spell attack, which is like either inflict wounds or vampiric touch. It's still the same number. So you're still adding your ability score, and you're still adding your proficiency bonus, whatever it is.
It's worded differently. So a lot of times if you're like, so wait, how do I roll this? Because I know how I roll my normal spell attacks, but this one says it's a touch attack. Is that different?
Yeah.
And usually if it's a touch attack, that means that you have to physically touch them. For some reason, it took me a really long time to figure that out. I think it's just because, again, we were playing 3.5, and it was a really unnecessarily complicated.
Well, and 3.5 rules actually were like really different. So
yeah, like when we switched to 5th edition, just something clicked, and I'm like, oh, that makes so much more sense now.
Yeah, that was one of the fun parts about switching from 3.5 to 5 was that we were still making things overly complicated when it didn't need to be. So when things ended up being really simple, we were like, no, wait, there has to be more to this.
Also, don't ever switch mid-campaign. It makes life complicated more so than it already is.
Yeah.
We did that, and I think we had already made our campaign overly complicated as players. So there's that.
Yeah.
I think that was after we bought a person. I had a lot of feelings.
It was after you bought a person.
I was telling someone about that recently.
It was right around the time you tried to cremate your dog.
Ah, yes. No, I didn't try to cremate my dog. I tried to bring back my dog, and then we ended up cremating the dog in an alley. D&D, guys. People do really weird things.
Yeah. So I think that almost just about does it for ability scores as far as how to get them, how to use them,
What those numbers mean.
yeah.
Yeah, so next time we'll go into a little bit more detail about how to roleplay ability scores the right way and the wrong way. There's a lot of wrong ways. Yeah, so that'll be next episode. Anything else before we go?
No.
Okay, bye.